Smaller.
Oh, thank you for reminding. So at 8:30 in the morning, it will be an alarm from the state of Sao Paulo saying, meh, meh, meh. Everybody up. So we move to the next talk. So as you can imagine, it's really a pleasure for me introducing Professor Ignacio Pagonabarraga, and from the University of Barcelona, and is the current director, the actual director of the Institute of Complex Systems. And his talk today is about emergent phases and synchronization in active matter.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Albert, and all the organizers for the invitation to be here. It's really a pleasure, and I will be, sort of in a way building on what we heard from Everton on the area of active matter, so about objects that collectively move together and self-organize. And I'll try to make a connection with synchronization transitions, because as I will show you, in active matter, many times we talk about phases and morphologies and structures. We do not use these terms, but at the end, I think that what lies behind is very much connected. So I think there are commonalities, and I'll try to touch on a few of them. And hopefully that will trigger discussions that we can continue during the rest of the workshop. So active matter is an area that has grown a lot, I would say, since the late 90s from a more physical point of view. But it actually, if you want on general terms, we can say that an active system is a system in which the relevant elements that make it are able to convert energy into mechanical motion from one way or the other. And as such, they are intrinsically out of equilibrium. Even if you are not driving, there is no gravity, no forcing this ability through metabolism, through catalysis, through different means, then they allow them to be in steady states. And if you want, from a statistical physics point of view, this is an interesting class of non-equilibrium systems, because that is qualitatively different of how we think of driven systems. And typically, in those cases, we don't have like a Boltzmann distribution that we can use as a basis or as a reference, as we are used to do. Now, talking of active systems gets natural inspiration from nature, and in nature, you can find, I think this is one of these prototypical examples of these starlings that are able to fly together without a leader, but also you can go to smaller scales. Bacterial colonies, epithelial tissues also have the ability to move. And even if we go inside the cell, cellular metabolism is very much controlled by the ability of certain proteins to bind to microtubules, to filaments, to be able to transport cargoes, to control where energy or where matter is being consumed. And so, in a way, it depends also when we talk about active matter on what scale we work at. And also, nowadays, it's not only nature that inspire us. We can also, in the lab, produce colloidal particles that these are in a particular type of colloids that through an oscillating electric field can generate an instability. And then, again, they can form these interesting structures, spatiotemporal, that, in this case, looks as if they are making a race in this circuit, or at an intermediate scales. I think we have also already seen micro robots that through local interactions are able to also perform or organize in non-trivial structures. So, as I said, from a fundamental point of view, because there is no equilibrium, their behavior is very different from what we know. And I like to show this as a prototypical example. These are relatively old experiments where Kalash et al. Were able to make these E. coli fluorescently labeled, so they're green, and they put them in a box with a barrier of these obstacles, a line. So in equilibrium, they are not attractive. So in equilibrium, these bacteria should be uniformly distributed over the box. But here they self-trap because they sort of more easily funnel from the wide side to the narrow side of this trap, if you want. And if you now would think in putting this together, you can then make them come in one end and go at the other and generate a flow. So the steady state of the system is the ability to sustain this motion just by eating. If they have food, they can eat, and this is a sort of like a reverse implementation in the lab of Di Leonardo, where now this is a wheel, and then you see all these bacteria around, and again, when they collide through the two sides of this asymmetric wheel, because detail balance is not there, there is a net force, and then that makes it rotate. So you could, in principle, extract work out of this active systems, okay? So that's just to set up the why this is interesting and why these are special, different, and has attracted a lot of interest. And one way to make progress is by looking into model systems. And I would say from a theoretical point of view, there are two reference systems. One, and I will refer to both of them. One is active Brownian particles, so particles that diffuse with a certain motion, self-propulsion, and the other is the big check that was intended to represent or to be used to describe the starlings, where particles they move and then they tend to align with the average orientation of the neighbors. So let me show you why these systems are different from what we know from equilibrium, and why this is also interesting from what we are looking at in this workshop. So let me start with just how emergence appears and how new phases can develop. This was the first part of my title, and this is with these active Brownian particles. Very quickly, active Brownian particles is a Brownian particle that is active. So what is our Brownian particles? Particles that diffuse around. We know this. This is a very basic model in statistical mechanics where we have diffusive particles. So we have the position that the velocity will essentially have a certain diffusion, and then there will be a force when there are other ones because of steric interactions, for example. They cannot overlap. So this is a net force on the particle that will come from the corresponding Hamiltonian. And then if we only have that, then that's Brownian diffusion. But now each particle has an arrow, and this arrow has a direction, Ni, and then they self-propel along this vector. And that seems very simple, and then this vector will also rotate. I will show you results in 2 dimensions. So this vector can be parameterized in terms of one angle, theta, and the angle theta simply diffuses. So very simple. This angle will diffuse around, but it takes some time to diffuse. So what happens when two of these particles come close and collide makes it qualitatively different from the usual collision. If you think like in billiard balls, for simplicity, this force is hard sphere. We know that they come in and then will go out. But now, even if we have the collision for the velocities, still the self-propelling direction doesn't change. So if you have two particles coming together, they keep on colliding. So they are like stubborn particles because they need to wait until this director diffuses away to be able to escape from each other. So this gives you a persistence interaction, a persistence collision, and that is enough to, again, here I show you simulations of this model for different densities and different velocities. As you increase the velocity, if the density is not very high, very low, then this sort of like increase or persistence collision leads to a phase separation that wouldn't be there in equilibrium. So this is an intrinsic non-equilibrium transition because of the activity of the particles. That's called motility-induced phase separation. And the use of these simple models is interesting because we can make this dimensionless, and actually there are essentially 3 parameters that are relevant: the density, and then a ratio, what is called Peclet number in the community, which, if you want, d theta is this rotational diffusion. So 1 over d theta is the time it takes this particle the vector to rotate away, and then sigma is the particle size. Sigma over b0 is the time it takes to move its own size. So this is kind of like how much do I need to transverse, move along before I can forget about my memory of which direction I'm moving at. And the other is, I mean, this epsilon is the typical magnitude of this Hamiltonian force. So now there is a competition of how strong the self-propulsion is compared to the steric force. Normally, we'll consider that this is always very large, because if you have hard spheres or particles that have steric interactions, they will not be able to overlap. Yeah, so this is not very important. So actually, there are two parameters: concentration and Peclet number, allows you to identify a phase diagram. So we can characterize the behavior of the system, and actually, this is the same but rotated, because that's how it was published in the journal, just to make things a bit confusing, but it's the same as before. Now, phi is vertical, Peclet is horizontal, and this is this transition that I was telling you, this MIPS. So there is a possibility to have a coexistence between a low density and a high density. And actually, if we go to Peclet, this is for statistical mechanics consistency, if we go to Peclet very small, we are in equilibrium, and in equilibrium, hard disks have a liquid-solid transition. So all the things that you have see here is like the underlying equilibrium phase transition, which tells us that this is an intrinsic non-equilibrium phase transition. It's not like an extension of something that existed in equilibrium. It's a new type of transition. These phase diagrams are very sensitive to the shape. So if instead of disks, you now take disks, link them together, making dumbbells, the phase diagram for dumbbell is quite different. And actually, how you go from one to the other is still not understood, just to say that details such as shape have a very strong influence on phases that emerge in this non-equilibrium system. But I wanted to focus on something a bit different, which is, even if I forget about the change in shape, there is, if you think in elongated particles that move, when they collide, they tend to align. So beyond the collision and the stubbornness I was telling about, in principle, there will be a tendency for these objects to move, to align together, and therefore there is a rotational translational coupling that can be induced by the shape. But even, so going to the simplest case, even if you think on spheres or on disks, so there is nothing in the shape that makes them align. Actually, when they, now it depends how do they move. If they are in a liquid medium, when these particles, these microorganisms, these colloids move along, they will generate a flow around them. This flow in general has a vorticity component. Vorticity makes the particles rotate. So if you have this particle moving, generates a certain vorticity, this one, so this is moving, generates certain vorticity, this one will rotate. If it could be a sphere without an arrow, I couldn't care less, because it's always a sphere. But now, because there is the arrow, if this sphere rotates, it will affect how it translates. And then they will have a tendency to align simply because they are moving in a medium, and the medium is distorted due to the own activity of the particles. So it's a coupling effect, and therefore it means that even if you have spherical objects, they can align. So again, in terms of a simple model, one way to try to capture this is basically extend what I've shown you before. This is the same equation as before, active Brownian particles with this rotational diffusion for the arrow, for the vector. But now there can be a coupling between the two. There will be here a constant, an area of interaction, or, whether it's hydrodynamic or it's what is the physical mechanism will affect this. It can be more complicated, but again, in very simple terms, it's like a simple way to extend the reference model and try to see how this alignment affects. And now you can start seeing that this alignment looks really like a Kuramoto type interaction. So we have now these mobile active Brownian particles that can have this coupling, and associated to this Kuramoto coupling, so if you want, you have an angle, but now what is specific of these systems is that this internal variable, the angle, is also determining the translation. So the non-trivial part is this interplay between the translation and the alignment, because the translation will affect how many particles you have in a certain environment, how do they interact. So it's not that the angle is a slave to the translation of otherwise, it's just that it's a real dynamical coupling between the two type of variables. Now, this constant here gives us another dimensionless parameter. I can compare the time, this is like a frequency if you want, as D0 is also a frequency, in the right units. And so I can have now a comparison between how long it takes the two particles to align because of the interaction, or how long they take to disalign because of noise. So this is this parameter G that I've shown you here. Obviously, if G is 0, go back to what it was before. But now, as a function of G, because it's now a three-dimensional phase diagram, show you here a cut for a given volume fraction, I can vary the Peclet number, so the degree of activity, and then how quickly they align because of this Kuramoto type interaction. And typically, you want to vary, so I can identify a transition between a disordered and now a polar aligned phase, which is this phase in which particles will move together. So this is in the context of this active matter, this is called a polarization transition, or it's a transition where you break Galilean invariance because you start with a system where the center of mass velocity is 0, and now you get a net center of mass velocity because of this alignment, because the alignment is coupled to the translation. Now, this can be characterized as usually in phase with phase transitions with an order parameter that is like computing all these unit vectors, whether they are parallel to each other or not, and that's what we call the parameter P, but essentially is from the language of synchronization, it's like a synchronization transition, and this is the parameter that tells us when it is synchronized. So you could say that here on the right, we have a synchronized state that is moving along, and because of the finite size and steric interactions, I mean, that's clear, so one could say, well, that's it. But when you start looking into what's going on the right-hand side of this the phase diagram, we can have quite diverse type of structures where now they globally are aligned, but then locally, because of the interactions and excluded volume, they can form clusters of different sizes. And actually, we all even identify phase where there was a distribution of clusters that was quite broad. So you could have clusters of many different sizes. Still, globally, there was a net polarization. And I think that sort of fits on some of the discussions we have had earlier about this interrelation between global and local synchronization, which is not something that normally people look at from that side in this system. So also, for example, we saw the ability to form lanes, depending on the degree of persistence, can have structures where they come and form clusters that are system size, they span the whole system size. This is like a rectangle shape, so we favor the formation of a band. But again, could be that the particles align parallel or perpendicular to these objects, so that then they are moving mostly up and down or perpendicular. And again, in both cases, you have synchronization. You are always here, but clearly the structures are different. So it's quite rich in terms of the spatiotemporal organization of clusters in the synchronized phase. We even, just to finish this part, we even looked into what happens if you generalize the coupling. And as I said, no, when it's hydrodynamic, then they tend to align parallel to each other, so it's a polar alignment. But there are certain microorganisms that are elongated where they can align parallel or anti-parallel to each other. So there is another scenario where you could have here this the Kuramoto type coupling with K1, which is what I told you now, or 2, and then we have this nematic. And actually, if you look into the phase diagrams, again, as a function of the Peclet and G for these two cases, you have the same. You have the disordered, some cases you can, and then this polar phase, the synchronized. But again, the structures are very different. In the ferromagnetic case, there are the tendency to eventually form these clusters that I was showing you before. The nematic case is much more chaotic or disordered. We haven't really still understood what's going on or how to characterize the structure of the clusters there. Okay. Now I wanted, how I'm doing, yeah. I wanted now to address another aspect of this synchronized or polar state for these particles that basically couple, no, this angular translation, and which is to try to understand how stable this synchronized phase is. Now to do that, what I'm going to show you is numerics that we looked at, but I mean the simulations that I've shown you with the steric interactions are I think they are realistic for particles, for the type of systems we're thinking of, but they are time consuming. So in order to be able to get to large systems, and I will show you why we were thinking and looking at large systems, we step back to an even simpler model for this coupling, which is actually the initial model proposed by BigCheck in '95, where we forget about steric interaction. So now particles are point particles. Still, they are point particles. They move with a given velocity. If you remember, in the active Riemann particle, I had this term plus the steric interactions plus the random noise. So I get rid of everything, only translation. And then the angle, as before, that has the diffusion plus the alignment. So the angle is the same, the angle dynamics, but the position dynamics is simplified as much as possible. Now, again, in this case, it is known what the phase diagram is. This has been work in the past. This work by BigCheck initially and Chate and co-workers. And then it's clear that, again, here you have the density. And I mean, in the context of the BigCheck models, people do not talk about Peclet number that I was showing you before. They put the noise strength, but the noise strength is like the inverse of the Peclet number. Okay, so just as you know, notation, depending who is, the different models use different notation, but it's the equivalent. So we sort of like decrease the noise, increase the activity, this Peclet number, and then we will go from a gas phase disorder to this synchronized phase where particles move along. It's called a polar liquid sometimes in the literature of BigCheck. And it's like a first order phase transition, so there are coexistence of bands and so on. So that's clear. Now, what is known, what I want to see is now what happens when we move onto this ordered phase and see what happens when, in principle, one does something relatively stupid. And you say, why are you doing this? I can tell you why we ended up here. But it's something, in principle, very simple, which is I take a system which stays in this polar ordered phase, and now I introduce an inclusion. So I basically fix a disk in the system, and this disk, you see it here, is small. It doesn't move, and then when the particles collide with it, then they cannot penetrate. And basically, they don't penetrate, but they don't change the direction, as I said. They keep on colliding. There is this stubbornness. They will be there until the random term will allow them to escape. So this is now you'll see a movie. This is not the whole system. It's a part of the system. This is a relatively large system. Color tells you what's the orientation of the particle. So cold colors are particles moving to the right, and warm colors are particles moving to the left. And then black means there are no particles. Because we have point particles, they can accumulate. There are large density fluctuations here, much larger than in the simulations that I showed you before with excluded volume. That's a peculiarity of this model that is very compressible. Now, you'll see they move, and then you say, well, the particle there is just a small perturbation, so who cares? But you will see that at some point, there are like fluctuations around it because particles tend to stay, but that sometimes the perturbation is strong enough to be able to reverse the motion of the whole system. So it was moving to the right, the order parameter was to the right, and it goes to the left, and now it goes to the right. So you could say, well, I mean, it's something small. Why a local perturbation has to destabilize the global synchronized state of this in this polar ordered phase? So I will show you here. So here is now, this is an overall movie. You see that's going on. Here will, obviously, once we see one, we can focus and see what's happening. So this is a particular event focused around the inclusion. And what you will see, I help you. So you will see that particles are moving now. In this case, is warm. So from right to left, some particles will accumulate there. And then if they stay long enough, they can accumulate particles, and then at some point it will escape. If when they escape, it correlates with a moment where there are not many particles on the other side, then can escape. And that's what you can see here in the movie now. So you can see the color here in the back. This is a successful event. There are many unsuccessful events, but this is a successful where it can just escape. Okay? So the fact that they accumulate and escape is not so surprising. what is surprising is that it can have such a strong effect. That's why we decided to, so actually if you look at the statistics, you look at the orientational order and the angle, and then it changes with certain periodicity. These are these events where it's reversing. And actually here is a measure of the synchronized order parameter as a function of the system size. This is the prediction from the value that it should have without this inclusion, and the inclusion is always the same size. And here you see we went like 3 orders of magnitude in size. That's why we needed this type of simulations. Because, I mean, it seems that it's kind of like converging to the expected results, but then it goes down again. Of course, we cannot be sure if going longer, it will go up, and then asymptotically, it will recover. But so far, for all the systems that we managed to get to, this was there. So we think it's an intrinsic effect associated to the fact that there are these large density fluctuations. And actually, when one looks at the correlations in this polar phase, they are long range. There are strong long range correlations. And our understanding is that this triggers the ability to generate large enough perturbation that can destabilize the synchronized state. And actually, we even looked, as we moved deeper from the disorder to the polar order, characterize the time it takes to have one, on average, to have one of these changes of depolarization. And actually, it increases very fast. So again, this is exponential. Sorry, this is, a logarithmic scale. So it's there, but it's not easily observable, but it's something that is a feature of these systems, okay? And I will not go there. I mean, we even tried to compare this with, there is a Turner theory to predict this polar order phase and try to compare that. I can go in more detail into this more theoretical part if you're interested in. In the remaining time, I don't know how much I'm left. At least, okay, I wanted also to touch into another way in which this rototranslational coupling leads to non-trivial behavior and how this synchronization of the angle affects strongly the type of phases and morphologies of the systems, which is what happens if we now introduce chirality. And chirality is something that, again, these active systems are more prone to exhibit than equilibrium counterparts because of the fact that they are out of equilibrium, and there are a number of mechanisms that can lead to chirality. I mean, if the particles that self-propel are irregular, it's natural to think that somehow when they move, they can rotate. But even with spherical particles, in the case of these colloids, I was mentioning that there is one type of colloids that can propel by diffusiophoresis. There is a hydrodynamic instability if they move fast enough. Or, for example, there are experiments by Bechinger of colloids, self-propelling colloids in a polymer solution. The viscoelasticity of the medium introduces a memory retardation in how the medium reacts to the motion of the particle, and that leads also to the ability of these particles to exhibit circular trajectories. So in the absence of the polymer, it's more like a linear, I mean, with the corresponding diffusion, but then you can have different shapes of trajectories. Or, for example, these are experiments in Barcelona. If you have magnetic particles that you make them rotate, again, when they rotate, they generate a flow around them, and if there's another one that allows them to generate a rotational flow, that can also lead to quite rich structures as these rotating particles hydrodynamically, again, is through the fluid, attract each other and can agglomerate, okay, or also through confinement. So there are different mechanisms that allow these particles to acquire an intrinsic frequency, if you want. So it's then one can also come back to the model that I was showing you. Again, and this is for the big check model, so there is no steric interactions for the translational variables, no noise, just self-propulsion. But now the angle of this vector will have the coupling, Kuramoto-like coupling, then can be noise, and now there can be an intrinsic frequency. And as you can imagine, this frequency will mean that if you think of two of them next to each other, they can phase lock and start moving in circular orbits. One can identify the relevant dimensions parameters, a bit more work. We can discuss this if you want, but we can identify which ones to look at. When instead of two, now you have many, again, there is an interesting phase diagram. Here, because there are different parameters, now we have to, again, decide how to cut in phase space. So here is the intrinsic frequency as a function of this, the Kuramoto coupling, if you want. So if the coupling is very weak, you will have a uniform disordered state. But then at not very strong intrinsic angular velocities, you can have these some places with bands or eventually droplets. And then again, sometimes they have these droplets that do not seem to really coalesce in a single one. So you have like a distribution of these droplets. Yeah? So you have this, so in a way, these particles are able to come together, as I said before, but not all of them together necessarily in one unique cluster. They can also reorganize or distribute spatially, addressing again this question of how the spatial correlations are related to the synchronization. And we also then, because as I said, in some cases, like in these magnetic colloids, the magnetic field will fix the angular velocity, the angular velocity. But in some others, the angular velocity is an instability. So you can have particles, if you have spheres, they can be rotating clockwise or anti-clockwise with equal probability in principle. So it also makes sense to think on a case where now this angular, the intrinsic frequency can vary, and we consider a case where the mean, so 50% are clockwise, 50% are counterclockwise as a case to look what happens. And there again, instead of, in terms of this G and now the difference between these two, the positive and negative frequency, you have a weak coupling is always disordered. And now what we found is that the flocking phase that was seen before, now it's slightly more richer, because if you look at the counterclockwise or clockwise, they both will sort of like tend to move in one of these polar liquid phases, but the two species move not exactly parallel, not necessarily parallel to each other. So here the red arrow means that the average orientation for the red, say clockwise, and then the blue for the counterclockwise. Yeah? So it's a slightly richer flocking phase. And on the other hand, when you move to a stronger frequency mismatch, there we did not observe in this case this micro flux that I was showing you before. Here they seem to really sort of like the counterclockwise and clockwise form two chiral aggregates that sort of like tend to bring a significant fraction of the particles, and then there is like a disordered background as well. Okay, so and again, so it is possible to write down again. I was referring to the fact that the Toner and Tu have like a reference theory to explain this flocking transition, this synchronization for these moving particles. This can be extended also to understand these phases conceptually in the same framework. So I think I'll stop here. So I hope I've introduced active matter, why it's relevant, why we have it around, and it opens new conceptual challenges, and in particular the ability to form new phases. And as soon as there is some sort of alignment, this coupling between the rotation, the angle, and the translation leads to new phases. And I think that's a subclass of what you would think of all these synchronization systems, where this rototranslational coupling leads to a number of rich implications, like what happens when you have chirality, or the sensitivity of these ordered phases to disorder or to perturbations. So this has been done, as I've told you, of different projects. So the part on the part on the destabilization was done by Joan and Jure in Beijing, and then also with Hugh and Benoit. And the other part, the part on the alignment that I was talking initially, was done with Demian and Albert and Pasquella partially. And thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Ignacio. well, some hands up.
Thank you. Thank you. It was very nice. About this movie that you showed about with these rotating individuals, the chirality, is there, besides this spatial pattern, is there a...
You mean here?
No, no, no. I think it's 2 slides before that one.
This one?
Yeah, there. Yeah, besides this, spatial pattern, is there like a temporal pattern?
Yeah, sometimes yes. No, for example, it can be, yes. Okay. It can be. So, for example, I mean, these are 2 different, I didn't go into the details because this is just to show that there are different mechanisms. In the case of these magnetic colloids, indeed, in some cases they tend to form structures that are statistically well-defined. In some others, I mean, I would say statistically there is a well-defined distribution. In this case, these are self-propelling particles in a liquid water medium where you have droplets of one facing the other. Here it's a bit more subtle because it depends whether the activity of the particles allow them to escape or not. So because if they can go from one to the other, sometimes they lead to then very distorted droplet structures. And then there the temporal dependence becomes more relevant.
Okay, yeah. Okay, okay. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. This is all very amazing. I was wondering about experimental systems with, for instance, tissue cells, where you could put this inclusion and you would see that sort of thing. But I believe that density fluctuations would not be that large in these experimental situations. So is it possible then?
I would say I cannot rule that out. However, as I mentioned, I think this clear, very strong inversion is very much sensitive to this compressibility. Now, to some extent, these cells are relatively compressible because they are very deformable. So maybe that's a more likely scenario that if you think in colloidal particles. But on the other hand, then the other issue is that you need to go to quite large systems. So I haven't seen it done, and I couldn't rule it out, but I don't know how hard it can be. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I have something very general question. The point is, you mentioned the Bookcheck model, okay? Well, the Bookcheck model we know has been in the air, let's put it this way, for over 30 years. So a lot of very strong people have been trying to explain things, in particular the murmurs of the flux, because those are very interesting. So those are beautiful. And then what I want to ask you is this. I mean, in all these years, and this important model that essentially has failed because nobody has found the solution. And what do you think would be missing? I mean, I know that in the audience there are several people who think about it, but what do you think could be missing in that model or in some general model to explain it? Because some of the experiments that you had been showing, I mean, one looks at that and it looks like you are so near. So, but only near. I mean, not as eventually solving. I mean, so what do you think that is missing in trying to explain this problem?
Well, I mean, as you said, probably you need to ask this to different people and you will get different answers. I don't think that there is. I would say the ambition or the vision of the Big Check model was to create or to propose like what could be a reference system to describe the class of this type of transitions, a bit like an Ising model for the flocking transition. And I think to some extent, if obviously the model as such, it has worked. Now when you think how does it work in experiments, or how much you can really use to understand or to explain experimental setups, then is what you say, it's there. I think I mean, some people will claim that there are experimental realizations that show parts or certain aspects of this transition. So some things are clear. But for example, what I've shown you about how sensitive this a perturbation, distortion can impact the structure of this polar order phase indicates that we still need to understand better the nature of the nonlinear couplings in this big segment. I mean, Turner 2 was very successful, no, because that was really published not later, after the simulations by Big Bang. And somehow that established a theoretical framework that explained the transition, and people have used that to explain some experiments. But there is a certain degree of linearization and assumptions about, for example, isotropy in properties of this polar phase. More recent works have been showing that this is not the case. Now, when this is relevant or not, that's something that is not clear. So for me, that's still something open. Another, I mean, when I'm showing you the behavior with these hardcore particles and try to compare to Big Check, is Big Check asymptotic for any system? Again, I don't think that's completely understood. So I think it's still, I would say the basic framework is clear, but when you start looking into these more detailed questions, I think there are still challenges ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. No more questions in the audience? Okay, in this case, let's thank again the speaker. So then we come to the last talk of the day. So by Professor Klaus Lenhertz. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. And as you can see here, so the title of the talk is What Have We Learned About the Mechanistic Underpinning of the Pre-Ictal State? So, Klaus, please.
Thank you. We come back to epilepsy. Yeah, we have seen many other things